Okay, it is the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm just going to have my camera on for a minute while I'm introducing myself, and then we'll focus on the presentation. But welcome today. I'm Ceil Strauss. I'm the state floodplain manager in Minnesota, and we'll be talking about floodplain and watershed higher standards. We will be having Dan Pedrick talk about shoreline higher standards later this week, but today we'll be focusing on things that are more applicable to floodplains and just to the watershed in general. We'll talk about some of Minnesota's state laws that are higher standards than the national minimums, a quick reminder of those. Spend some time talking about why do we have higher standards and what are some reasons your community might want to think about for higher standards. And then spending most of the time giving some examples of higher standards that we have around the state and some examples from other parts of the country. And then just in general, encouraging some other ways to preserve and restore the natural beneficial functions in your communities, not necessarily with higher standards. So starting with the Minnesota regulations that we have in place, as we were saying on the 50th anniversary of these regulations, 69 was a watershed year. We had our Scientific and Natural Areas Act, our Floodplain Management Act, and our Shoreland Management Act all come in 1969. And a lot of good protections were included in these regulations. For the floodplain regulations, we right from the beginning have had a higher low floor requirement than the national requirement. The national requirement is that walking surface of the lowest floor is at the base flood elevation, the 100-year flood elevation or higher. And in Minnesota, right from the beginning, we added a foot of freeboard and the stage increase that you see when you're creating the floodway. And so that means that our lowest floor is a foot to a foot and a half higher than the federal minimum. We also, right from the beginning, of course, as you look at filling in parts of the floodplain, that means the remaining part of the floodplain, the water levels get higher. Federal requirements are that it doesn't go up more than a foot. And in Minnesota, we've said it can't go up more than half a foot. And if there's any existing buildings, it can't go up at all if there's existing buildings that would be impacted. We limit uses in the floodway. We don't allow any new buildings in the floodway in general. We've got some really nice language in our rules. Some of it's in the PCA parts of the rules, talking about no pollutants in the floodplain. And it's a nice broad definitions of what's pollutants there. And then we also have some regulations that regulate beyond the FEMA mapped flood zones. And one of them is that if this is the FEMA flood zone and there's an area adjacent to that that's below the flood elevation, our state rules say you're still regulating that area that's below the base flood elevation, even if the FEMA map doesn't show that included. Again, that's a state higher standard. And another big area where our state minimums get into areas beyond the FEMA mapped floodplains is in our shoreland districts. And that's within 1,000 feet of lakes and either 300 feet of the river, or if the mapped floodplain goes further, that's part of the official shoreland area. And within shorelands, we have lot size minimums, lot width minimums. We've got setbacks for the structures. Within half the setback distance, we've got limitations on what kind of grading and vegetation removal can take place. We've got some nice vegetation management and aesthetics screening requirements. We've got bluff protections and a lot of good reasons for those bluff protections. Trying to keep that erosion from the bluffs going into the lakes and rivers, preventing buildings from being at risk, and then some of the scenic beauty that gets lost when you've got eroded areas. Or another area is we have impervious surface limits in our shoreland rules. The other reminder is that within shoreland districts, we do still require minimum elevations of buildings. And some of you have heard us talk before about our shoreland rules were actually based on ones that were adopted first in Wisconsin. This is one of the differences between our shoreland regs and Wisconsin's, is that we added low floor requirements within that 1,000 feet of lakes and 300 feet of rivers, even if it's not in a mapped floodplain area. So here's an example where we've measured 1,000 feet from the lake, and they still have to require the minimum elevations. So for instance, in our 8 counties that don't have any FEMA floodplain maps, because they knew that we had shoreland rules and they knew that most of the development was within 1,000 feet of those lakes, and they do have minimum elevations still in those areas. Other higher standards in many states, and I was surprised when I started learning about what other states had, because I've grown up in Minnesota and worked in Minnesota for many years and know our regs, but we've got higher standards in terms of regulating our public waters and not allowing filling in of those areas to create development areas. And we've got our more recent, relatively speaking, the 1991 Wetland Conservation Act, where we protect a lot more wetlands beyond the public waters inventory of basins and require replacement of those areas that are allowed to be filled. And we had the buffer mapping effort a few years back. And if you're not familiar with that, you're newer to the state, we do have a website mapping these areas and showing the kinds of buffers that we have, either the smaller buffers that were more on ditch areas and the 50-foot buffers that were more on the public waters. Again, those are some of just a brief, quick update of some of the higher standards that we've already got at the state level. So today's presentation is focusing on higher standards that go beyond the Minnesota state minimum requirements. And there's a lot of great reasons, and what makes sense in your community is going to vary, but many of the things we'll be talking about have to do with health and safety protections, protecting people from flooding risks. And we're having increasing flood magnitudes due to changes in climate here. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. For some areas where flood insurance is mandatory, it can help save money on those insurance premiums or prevent needing to have the mandatory flood insurance and being able to choose how much coverage you want because you're not officially in the floodplain. There are communities that do have many policies and have gotten into the community rating system, something that FEMA runs. If you're not familiar with this and your community's got a lot of flood insurance policies, definitely reach out to us. We can tell you more about this program, but it's basically a program where you show FEMA the higher standards, the better outreach and communication you have, all the good things you're doing to protect people from flooding and the impacts of flooding. And you get points, and then the more points you have, then you get higher discounts for the people who have flood insurance policies in your communities. So those communities in particular want to be able to show the higher standards that they've got. And then these last two are really applying to the entire watershed. Presenting increases in flooding and decreasing runoff, that's not just happening within your mapped floodplain. That's something that, if we can impact the entire watershed, can make a difference. And that water running off that watershed, the quality of what's running into those lakes and rivers is impacted by the entire watershed, not just your floodplain. which is why we decided to call this floodplain and watershed higher standards, because everything that's within the watershed gets reflected in those areas of potential flooding. And speaking of watersheds, just a few slides here with Walter the Watershed. And I have to give credit to Jenny Shilcock. She did these drawings, boy, probably 10 years ago, but I just think they show the progression nicely. So here's Walter, he's happy, unaltered floodplain, free-flowing streams, diverse plants and animals, nice clean water. The stream banks are stable. We've got good infiltration and storage. We do have, maybe we've got the barn here. We've got a little cabin, but not a whole lot of development and disturbance here. But as development occurs, we start getting some interrupted flows. Here's a little dam. We've got a little bit more development, the tree lines being removed, more of the areas going to ag or to buildings. We start seeing eroded banks and less infiltration and more runoff in this case. And then even more development. We get more development, we get some bigger development. Pretty much most of the vegetation has been altered. We definitely start to see brown water and algae blooms and lower water quality, poor drainage, a lot less infiltration, a lot more runoff. Who is responsible for the watershed's health, and how can we help Walter? Because it really is the whole watershed we want to be looking at. And our regulations, they can help, but some other things that we want to keep in mind is not just the land use, that we are actually seeing changes in the rain. We're seeing it's a little bit warmer overall, the pattern over the decades, but definitely more of the water's coming in bigger and intense storms. We're seeing just since 2000, the rains that are 6 inches or more are 4 times as common. And the rains that are bigger than 3 inches are 65%. There's a 65% increase over the last few decades. That we're seeing more storms all times of the year. And that also means more ice jams and related risks during those times. And we're seeing longer periods of high water in the last couple of years, and I'll have a couple slides, I'll show this. But and also more risk of landslides as we have longer, wetter periods. That sets up the situation where those steep areas are more at risk of sliding. So here's a slide of the National Weather Service showing in 2019 how we had a record number of days above flood stage in St. Paul. And I just added this in here that this is the winter that wasn't so far. We're breaking all kinds of records this year, and huge amounts of rain. Well, relatively speaking, Christmas time, I measured over 2 inches in my home rain gauge, and we're seeing rain in January. In the past, we could not worry about flooding during December, January, February, and we can't say that anymore. We're definitely seeing more times where we're at risk, even in the winter time now, and shorter ice cover periods. And we do, if you're not familiar with this, you might want to take a look at the DNR's climate change site. We've got some nice information there, and we've got some cool tools. You can look in particular at temperatures and precipitation. You can choose one watershed or adjoining watersheds, or in this example, I chose the entire state, and play around with it and look at the temperature and precipitation trends in your area. Here's data that was pulled out of here that Kenny from our state climatology office put together, showing, and this is something he put together in the 2019-2020 period, showing the longest, wettest period for the 7-year average. And we were seeing way more of the lakes that were very high, especially those that didn't have outlets, because we'd had a particularly long period of wet. Now we've had more droughts, but we still are seeing those big storms and rain at times that we haven't had in the past. Some of the other things we're seeing that we want to think about from a flooding, potential flooding, and land use perspective is we're seeing higher groundwater in some areas. Those water tables were high, especially at the end of that 7-year running period with the highest precip on record. And so there's good reasons to look at minimum elevations in the entire communities, not just within the floodplain or the shoreland where it's required. And we're seeing more of those landslides and the stream bank erosion. And we can get into some of the reasons for that in maybe another presentation, but we are definitely seeing more of that. And some of your communities in particular are seeing that. We're seeing more of the urban flooding. Again, the big rains are affecting more areas that they weren't built with stormwater management in mind. That many of the older developed areas in our region, our FEMA region, in Chicago area and other states, they've had some really big rains and impacts that affected many, many people outside of the FEMA mapped areas in recent years. And speaking of unmapped areas, many of the areas were not mapped when FEMA first was doing the maps in the 70s and 80s. And now as they update the maps, they tend to just keep updating the areas that were already mapped, even though there's many streams and flood-prone areas that they did not map in the past and we're starting to see development. So the other issue is that our state laws only are part of the picture. Let's say this is your community boundaries. Say you've got a stream. You'd have regulations along that stream, either the public water regulations or your shoreland regs that cover within at least 300 feet, or the floodplain if it goes further, or you might have wild and scenic rules or other rules, or lakes where we regulate within 1,000 feet. But we've still got all these gaps in our communities where it's part of the watershed draining to those water bodies or to the low areas. And we're seeing more of those low areas within our communities being impacted because they don't have the storm water infrastructure in place. So why would you want to have protections for your community? Well, protecting your landowners, protecting your neighbors, protecting those emergency responders and first responders during times of flooding, not putting them at risk. If you have updated data showing your risk is higher, it's a good time to be looking at, should we be raising our standards? Should we be updating our modeling and our maps? Looking at the water quality. Many parts of our state, we're relying on people who recreate in our areas and enjoy our lakes and rivers. They're fishing, they're hunting, they're enjoying their cabins. And water quality, we know, is tied to values of the properties along those lakes and rivers, and all those natural benefits that are the reasons people are coming to those areas. Or your community's got a lot of buildings at risk. You've got those buildings on the edge of streams where they're eroding, and you've literally got buildings cantilevered over the streams. Or you've got a lot of flood insurance policies because you've got a lot of older buildings that are at risk that were built before your current regs. A lot of good reasons. And what you're going to discuss in your community really depends on the situation in your community. So we're trying to show some of the different reasons you might consider, and then some different kinds of regulations or policies you might consider. And just remember in general that yesterday's 500 years, probably today's 100 year, or yesterday's 100 years, probably today's 50 year. So things are changing over time. So you will need to do some balancing though when you propose some higher standards. You're looking at property rights and the impact that those regulations would have on what people can do and what they're used to being able to do versus What are the impacts of continuing to allow what you are allowing, and how are those things impacting other people? How are they impacting quality of life and quality of the water in your community? And one of the things that many communities are concerned about is, oh, will the courts uphold this if we try and have higher standards? Just a few slides about this, but in general, if you're treating buildings and properties consistently, you're not being arbitrary, capricious is important, that you're looking at what are the local concerns. You're not adding regs that maybe they're applicable in other parts of the country or other parts of the state, but they're things that are applicable in your community. And especially when you've got data to support this. And most of what we're talking about here is based on data that you can have from that. What kind of runoff are we seeing? What kind of runoff do we see as we take away the vegetation and increase the runoff, and the patterns that we're seeing based on the changes in historical rain and runoff. And just a reminder that the courts, they do uphold local community higher standards, that especially when they're meeting those 3 bullets above. But where communities lose in court is usually when they have not upheld their ordinance, they've not enforced their ordinance, and someone was impacted. An impacted property takes the community to court and says, we have this regulation, it's in our local ordinance, that was not enforced. I was impacted because the city or the county did not enforce the regulations. Or even I've seen examples of DOT in Iowa lost in court because they did not follow the regulations and properties were impacted. Some great legal resources. The National Association of State Floodplain Managers site has some really good stuff. They've been looking at this for years. This document was from 1984. This was in 2016. I have to mention that John Kussler was one of the people who helped put together Minnesota's the shoreland management regulations. And that's where I got some of the background on how they changed things from what Wisconsin did. I had a chance to chat with John when we were on our way to an event at the National Association of Floodplain Managers Conference. But a more recent document that they put out just in the last year here is a no adverse impact legal guide for flood risk management. So they've got a lot of updated information and cover what I was just talking about here in a lot more depth if you want to know about the legal impacts. And there's a link to that guide that'll be in the slides. And I should mention that we do send out PDFs of the slides afterwards, so you can see, and a lot of those links will be clickable links. But where do you work these higher standards in? They might make sense to have in your floodplain ordinance or your shoreland ordinance, or where you regulate wetlands, or maybe it's a special district. Where makes sense for your community will differ in different communities. I do want to mention that in our floodplain model ordinance and in our shoreland model ordinance, we do show recommended higher standards with blue bold font in the version that's on the website in a PDF format. And we do include these when we send out our recommended ordinance to communities. We do show which ones are higher standards. And even the communities that go through and look at each one of those blue bold areas and look at, does this make sense for our community? A very high percentage of those we're finding that our communities do adopt those higher standards. They look at the ones that are applicable. They might delete ones that, hey, this isn't applicable in our community. But it's really been nice to see that. We used to have these higher standards as a separate document and show them to communities, but they didn't. So much fewer of those higher standards would get into the local ordinances when they were suggested separately. But now that we've incorporated them in our model, many more of them are included. And we'll talk about some of these examples in the remainder of the hour here, but things like higher standards for critical facilities, dry land access, so you're not leaving buildings kind of a stranded island in the middle of deep floodplain. Looking at some higher standards for those non-conforming buildings, and looking at higher standards for substantial damage, basing the requirements on rep loss language that allows people to get their increased cost of compliance a part of the flood insurance. It's basically a rider on the flood insurance that if you have substantial damage based on repetitive losses, they can get extra up to $30,000 to help bring the building into compliance. So making them more resilient for future floods. Again, what can communities do? Well, you've got your toolbox with some of the higher regulations we're talking about, either those that were suggested in the blue font in our state model floodplain or shoreline ordinances, other ones that we're recommending in other places, like in this presentation and on our innovative regulations pages on our website. We also want to encourage you to look at a bigger toolbox and some of the other tools that go beyond higher regulations. Think about watershed level planning and prioritizing. And in Minnesota, we're doing that now with our One Watershed, One plan. Some great work together at the watershed level between the local government, the state, and others, and between communities, and some great work there. Better risk communication. It isn't necessarily regulations, but doing a better job of helping people to know where the risk is in their community and making them aware of some optional resources in your community. Some communities are looking at better ways of how they do things on community properties and having policies of we're going to make more of our land native vegetation and having more natural infiltration. Or a lot of the SWCDs and watersheds have some great trainings and cost share options to do some of these things that are beneficial overall. So the cartoon here, flash flood warnings in effect until 9 p.m. Our itsy ditsy spiders. Oh, thank heavens I'm safe and dry in here. Well, this is an example of where some communication on their true risk might be helpful. I did mention that we've got additional examples on our website. The Shoreland folks have had this page here for a few years now, where they've got some great examples of higher standard ideas. They group them by different types of standards. You can see the bluff standards and some density lot standards. And then they include some real examples, mainly from Minnesota. And we've been working on a floodplain page that's like this. I had originally hoped to have it ready before today's presentation, but didn't quite get it there yet. We're hoping to have that ready in the next month or two. So let's start talking about some of the different categories of other higher regulations. Some of these are identifying and regulating risk that's outside of those flood-prone areas, outside of the FEMA mapped areas, or outside of the shoreland areas. And we'll talk about some of identifying and regulating some of these areas in outside the flood-prone areas, dam shadows and meander belts. So one of those areas is, if you look at the floodplain, here we've got our floodplain. Here's our base flood elevation. Here's our stream. That's what's modeled as our 100-year. But as we allow development in the flood fringe area, that squeezes in the area that floods have to go during floods, and it actually increases the flood elevations. And if you looked at that increased flood elevation, you're really impacting areas that go outside the mapped areas. So here's this concept of regulating, looking at your regulatory flood protection elevation, which includes that stage increase due to allowing filling in the flood fringe, and works in our state minimum 1 foot of freeboard. And it can be covering a bigger area. In the flat areas, it's going to be a pretty wide area it would cover. In the steeper areas, it's not as wide. And this is, again, an option. This is the concept the feds have started to use for federally paid for projects done by public entities, that if federal funds are going into road improvement or mitigation projects, then they're supposed to be looking at this extended area that is adjacent to the floodplain and building higher and safer. So this is one way to look at it, is regulate the area that would be covered by the full regulatory flood protection elevation, not just that area covered by the 100-year floodplain or something in between. State of New Jersey, they actually regulate, I think they take 1.25 times the flow and figure out what that covers, and they regulate that area. So that's a different approach, that if you like that kind of a scientific based approach, that's another way to look at extending that area you regulate. Another example here locally is Edina's got this nice interactive map. They show the FEMA regulated areas here with the red, but they show a lot of local inundation areas. Look at all those areas that they're showing on their map that are not shown by the FEMA maps. And they're regulating those areas. They're limiting the fill, or at least the net filling, and they're requiring permits if someone wants to do work in these areas and making sure that they're not filling in their storage areas that are helping to protect the buildings in that community. So for a first tier suburb like Edina, this is a great way to help protect those citizens. You don't have as many ways to protect them and reserve areas because most of the development has already occurred. Or another example would be if you're downstream of a dam, and those are higher risk areas, especially the high hazard dams. And we don't have state or federal minimums saying you need to protect those areas, but definitely something to think about. And we've got the Wisconsin law that's been on the books, I think for like 50 years. Been on their books for a long time anyway. And they do protect that hydraulic shadow area downstream of dams. So meander zones, that's something that you've seen it. You see these areas where they try to straighten out the stream, but rivers are dynamic. They want to do this meandering. This is a great example here. Or another example where you can see the old oxbows. And if you're looking for, you've probably seen these. In fact, I have to digress a little bit here and say that some of you know, I was on vacation in Vietnam for a few weeks in February, and we're driving, Suzanne Giovanni, who many of you know, we're driving along, and all of a sudden we're out sitting on the same side of the van, and we saw a situation look just like this out the window. And we had to start laughing because we both saw it, we talked about it, we were excited to see another example, and we just couldn't help ourselves. We were seeing all kinds of floodplain issues when we were there. Anyway, this is something you do see. The rivers are dynamic. Here's an example in southeast Minnesota. The stream had been here, but then after the 2007 flood, it moved. It cut into this block of buildings. That's what you're seeing here. It moved over here. Another great example of the dynamic streams and thinking about, what can we do to protect some of these buildings? There's a lot of good reasons to have a meander belt, some kind of mapped area where you're going to protect within that area or have extra levels of setback or protection. and that allowing that stream to take its natural course, but basing where that you're going to map on science, trying to reduce the stream bank erosion that you're seeing, reduce those buildings that are at risk of falling in the river. And we've got a couple slides showing examples from Vermont and the state of Washington. And again, there's science behind there. If you're interested in this, we can work with our folks that work with the natural streams and do the studying of what the different types of streams, depending on the age of the stream and the kinds of soils and slopes. They'll look at what's the meander width that you would expect in that area. A lot of good information here. Here's an info sheet that gets into some of that background also, and they've got other information for the River Ecology Unit on their website. And just a quick mention of other states, they do have some standards. Again, you look at what makes sense in your community. In Washington, they're very concerned about salmon habitat and spawning. So they're looking at a setback for that. They're looking at the channel migration area and trying to protect those areas. They've got a newer update of their site with some cool videos, with getting into some of the reasoning behind there and some of the main concepts they're looking at. If you want to learn more about that, I suggest taking a look at that floodplainsbydesign.org site, which is a public, the state of Washington, some of those communities and private partnership they've got. Or in Vermont, they've got some great information on their page. They've also got this living in harmony with streams aimed at citizens. A lot of that could be applicable in many of our communities in terms of outreach, if you're looking for outreach ideas. Other things that you could do is cities that have lakes and rivers and have not been told by DNR that they had to adopt shoreland management regulations, maybe because they were little cities or they didn't have development pressure at the time that we were making those priority lists. They can be adopting some shoreland management regulations or a variation on them. They can always adopt them even if the DNR hasn't told them that they must adopt shoreland regs. And looking at minimum elevations and setbacks in a whole community. Okay, you can tell I use this in a national presentation because I'm pointing out where Plymouth is within Minnesota here. But this is an example of what Plymouth did. In the 80s, 90s, they're growing like crazy. They had lots of developments going around these wetlands. They were not big enough and wet enough that they were lakes and rivers that were covered by the shoreland management regulations. So they couldn't do things below the ordinary high, but above the ordinary high, there were no state minimums that they had to meet. And I was the area hydrologist at that time. I made lots of comments about, gee, yeah, it's not a shoreland district, but you should really look at some bigger setbacks and some minimum elevations. And they didn't listen. Here's another development, same thing. But then they had some rains, and I had great pictures. I couldn't find them now, but I had some great pictures of when, actually it was probably in this site here, where the foundations had gone in, and the foundations were like swimming pools because they had had a big rain, and they put in basements in this area right next to the wetlands. So anyway, they learned their lessons from this development. This is a development where the developer told everyone, call DNR, and if DNR will let you do it, you can do it. And so I had all these people calling me and saying, oh, I want to build out my yard. I want to put in a deck. I want to put in sheds. And I kept having to tell them, well, you can't do any of that. That's below the ordinary high. You've got only 10 feet or 20 feet between your house and the ordinary high. That's where you can do things. As a result of, I'm sure, these people's complaints, and then some of their elected and appointed officials became more aware. There was more, this is where those two developments were. People became more aware of this. The city adopted minimum elevations for their low floors citywide. They had a city stormwater management plan, and they divided everything into sub-watersheds, figured out their 1% in all those areas, and started requiring a 2-foot elevation above the 100-year for all those basins, all the flooding sources, including all the little stormwater ponds. And They looked at their wetlands and, gee, we're still got parts of the city that are developing, and what can we do to protect some of these areas for the future and have setbacks that are more reasonable that protect those areas. And they went through and classified their wetlands into different categories: the higher quality, middle quality, lower quality wetlands, and had different setbacks and buffer areas depending on the quality of the wetlands. A great effort that the city went through, and they did a lot of work when they did that. They also added a monument requirement that at the edge of the wetland, they put these monuments showing where the buffer went to. So they had this mandatory buffer, and they had the nice physical markers so that people were very aware of where the edge of the buffers were. So this is a picture taken in the 90s when they were first doing that. Moving on, talking about completely different requirements, looking at restricting critical facilities in the floodplain. Cedar Rapids, you probably heard about the big flood they had there. They had a hospital and a prison on an island that got flooded, and that was very traumatic, trying to get records out of there, trying to get people out of those flooded areas. Picture from Owatonna in 2010. Here's working on Methodist Hospital in St. Louis Park in 2014 when we had high water, a well house in Owatonna. Just all of these places where we've got either the main utilities for communities, the water supply, the electric supply, wastewater treatment, water supplies. Even if most of the buildings were protected, if they haven't got those utilities, then a huge part of your community can be impacted by a flood. And they don't need the extra work and stress of trying to build all these temporary sandbag and facilities here. So trying to look at saving that grief during floods, building smarter and safer when you are putting in the new utilities for other critical facilities and those hospitals, the nursing homes, the schools, the prisons, some of those kinds of things. Trying to not have them, any new ones for sure, and then retrofitting and fixing what you can for the old ones. This is in the national training that FEMA offers at their Emergency Management Institute. And I knew that they had this picture in their training when I went to it like 15 years ago. Gary was just there a couple weeks ago. They still have this picture and this example in their training that they use at EMI, showing a Rochester facility that had flooding, and unfortunately 4 people died in that 78 flood. The good news is that Rochester's done a lot of great work. Since 78, they've got all their reservoirs around the city. They did other work. They had a really big similar magnitude flood just a few years ago, and we saw little impact. So, kudos to Rochester and the many other communities that have done a lot of good work in Minnesota. But then also a reminder that as new facilities are planned, look at whether they're in the 500 year, look at higher protection for them. And one of the guides that has those specific requirements is the ASCE, American Society of Civil Engineers, I think that stands for. Their guide 24-14, they're actually in the midst of updating that. I expect a 24-24 to come out. But they look at Class 3 and Class 4. Class 3 is actually the same as our Minnesota minimum requirements, but for anything where they're essential facilities for emergency response or recovery, those standards are that you've got at least a 2-foot freeboard, or you're above the 500 year, whichever's higher. And the Minnesota floodproofing rules, 1335, Minnesota Rules 1335, we're in the process of updating those rules to adopt those standards, the ASCE 2414, because the current regs reference the 1972 Corps of Engineer floodproofing regs, which I know the majority of you were not born when these came out in 72. So that is something that you can see more details about ASCE 2414 in this link to some highlights that FEMA and ASFPM have. And again, that's something that is coming. We do have it as a higher standard in our model ordinance. It will be a requirement in the future. And this gets into just a little bit more detail about what's considered class 4. So it talks about hospitals, fire rescue, the utilities that are required during emergencies, communication areas, fuel storage tanks, lots of areas. And this is a summary of those standards. So other standards that some communities have is they're saying, hey, we've been through floods. You know, we've seen the trauma that it causes. We have big enough lots. Why are people building in those lower areas? They should be smart enough to build on the top in the higher areas. And since sometimes they're not smart enough, we're going to encourage them to build in those the areas that are safer. So many of our rural counties we've seen start to require that no new buildings are going in the 100-year floodplain. And many of the small communities that don't currently have development in their FEMA mapped areas, the special flood hazard areas, they're adopting our simplified state ordinance, which basically says no new buildings are going in the floodplain. If their development pressure changes in the future, they can change and update their ordinance to allow more. But many of the cities are saying, well, we don't need to develop in those areas. Those are low areas. Those are not areas we should be developing or encouraging development. Let's go ahead and adopt this stricter floodplain ordinance that says no new buildings are going in these areas. And many communities have higher minimum standards than the state rules. So here's some of the communities that have higher standards. Nicollet County for decades has not allowed new structures even in the 500-year floodplain. Well, that was initially because the zoning administrator at the time misunderstood the dark versus the light gray shading on the maps and was just saying you can't build in these shaded areas. But then the county did adopt rules consistent with that misunderstanding of the maps at the time. Chisago, Dodge, Mower, I believe, many of the counties are adopting these standards. In our model ordinance, we do have access requirements saying that you should have access no lower than 2 feet below the RFPE, which is half a foot to a foot below the flood elevation, so that vehicles don't have to go through deep water as floodwaters are going up and coming back down, that emergency managers and the first responders don't have to put themselves at risk going and rescuing people as they start to get flooded. Well, and along those lines, up in the Red River Valley, there were at least a couple of the counties where the emergency managers, the first responders said, we will no longer go out and do rescues after dark. We're not putting our first responders at risk after dark because you're out in these areas running your generators and trying to do flood fighting. You can do that flood fighting during the day, but get off those areas at night because we're not going to have response folks going out there. And I understand that people got very creative with how they kept their generators going. As I mentioned, the critical facilities at a minimum, having them have higher standards, and more of our communities are going with higher minimum standards. Here's an example when Mower County was talking to their county board and explaining what they had to do. They had to look at the map, figure out what the cross sections were upstream, downstream, go to the flood insurance study, figure out what the stage increase was, add that to the foot of freeboard and to the base flood elevation. And it was a pretty complicated process. And in the end, the county board supported, let's just go with 2 feet. Let's not have to do all these steps here and figure out what the exact number is. Let's just round up and say we're going to use 2 feet for our minimum elevation, and that'll cover all those scenarios. Our watersheds, we've had watersheds authorized since 1955, and we've got a lot of watersheds doing some great work. They can adopt rules, they can do projects, they can acquire property and have grants. Many of the watersheds have been around and doing these things for decades and doing some great work. Some common things that they're doing is they're updating their modeling with the latest data. They're doing some future conditions modeling and updating maps and regulating based on that. Some of the communities and watersheds limit impervious surface beyond what shoreland rules require. Some you can be looking at higher standards saying, hey, another thing to look at is how does the 500 year compared to the 100 year? We've got big areas with 500 year. Maybe we should making sure that we're meeting the difference going above our 500 year. And in this example, the 2 foot conveniently would meet that for much of the county. This is an example in Charlotte-Mecklenburg in North Carolina. They've got the FEMA maps, and then they looked at what their ultimate build expectations were and what the flood elevations would be. And so they show the floodplain based on ultimate development, and they have higher freeboards based on whatever that long-term development's going to be. Back to impervious surface, this is an example. Minnehaha Creek's got language about impervious surface within the 10-year floodplain that's higher, a higher standard. And many of the watersheds in cities look at not increasing the peak rates of runoff, or they're incorporating water quality improvements, doing infiltration of the first couple inches of runoff, all kinds of different things that they're looking at. Here's a little stormwater pond that was required because a church added some parking area. Here's a regional ponding area that's a multi-use. So here was after a rain of like 3 inches. I ran out and got a picture of that. And here's a picture after the rain has infiltrated and is being used. One of the multi-uses is this is the elementary school kids out there using this area for the little kids doing soccer. Bassett Creek on a tour that I think this might have been their 50th anniversary tour, that they're showing some of the infiltration basins. I believe this was an area where they had the tanks underneath where they have some extra storage. If anybody from the watershed's on, you can put in the chat what that requirement is. But as I recall, they had some tanked extra storage beneath in addition to some of these open space pond type areas. Other watersheds and counties have no net loss of storage that's stronger than the Wetland Conservation Act requirements. Dakota County, talking with Dee about that, she said that because they require it on the same parcel, and that's hard to do, it effectively means not very many people do filling in the floodplain because they can't find another place on their parcel to do their 2-to-1 compensation. Some of these may have been requirements. This was probably more of a retrofit because this was an existing target where they put in a bunch of rain gardens in the parking lot here. And they put up some nice signage explaining what they were doing. And when I show this to people outside the country, I point out this sign about how they're not allowed to put snow there, which other states don't have to worry about that, but an important thing for us to remember. And it's not just in the metro. Here's an example in Madison Lake where they put in a nice rain garden and have a very nice little placard here explaining what they were doing. And we have more data to help support this. We're getting the 25-year flood elevations in the newer areas where we're modeling, and the 100-year plus. Traditionally, they look at the median of where that flow is. That's what they use for the modeling for the 100-year, but it actually does vary. So they're looking at this the upper edge. And, how does that compare to maybe the 500-year in a community? Should they be regulating based on the 100-year plus or the 500-year rather than just the 100-year? And I'm down to like the last 2 minutes, so I'm just going to talk about some other communication options that our mappers talk about that are possible, some depth grids that look at it in terms of probability over a 30-year mortgage period. We've got some nice information encouraging retaining natural vegetation, talking about the benefits of retaining the natural vegetation, preventing erosion, water quality problems here. Again, retaining natural vegetation, getting your communities not go and chop it all off. Here's a local example where I'd literally the day before they went and chopped it off, taken a couple pictures, and this was the day after they chopped it off. Here's another example where they went and chopped down the plant I'd taken a picture of the day before because I was trying to figure out what plant that was. Now I know it's a mullein plant. There's some other nice resources that the No Adverse Impact series that the ASFPM has, and my cartoon, the end of the Itsy Bitsy Spider sequel. And I think that is my last slide. Of course, I tried to cram too much in here, and I did not seeing questions. But we'll stick around if people have questions. Say thanks to everyone for coming today. And we will send out PDFs of the slides afterwards.